Today is June 30th, 2026, and nearly 4 weeks ago, on June 2nd, this analysis's earlier coverage documented a specific operational sequence whose technical details deserve fuller examination now because the layered missile defense architecture and the targeting chain analysis from that period directly inform how this analysis should read everything documented since the GBU-72 strikes on Isfahan, the June 6th 02-30 engagement, the Operation Sledgehammer targeting list, and the fourth straight closure this analysis has tracked through the ever-lovely and subsequent vessel attacks. Going back to examine the specific interception rate mathematics and the missile defense layering this analysis, established 4 weeks ago, provides the quantitative foundation that the more recent tactical coverage has assumed without fully restating. 4 weeks ago, Iran struck Ali al-Salem Air Base in Kuwait 3 times within 5 days, a specific, concentrated targeting pattern against a single American installation whose repetition deserves examination as a coherent campaign rather than 3 isolated incidents. On May 28th, during what was nominally an active ceasefire period, Iran fired a Fatah 110 short-range ballistic missile at the base. Kuwaiti Patriot air defense batteries intercepted the missile, but the intercept was only partially successful. Debris from the engagement still landed inside the base perimeter, wounding 5 Americans, 4 service members, and 1 contractor, and destroying 1 MQ-9 Reaper drone outright while heavily damaging a second, representing approximately $60 million in lost or damaged drone assets from a single missile engagement. CENTCOM confirmed these losses publicly. Then, on Sunday night, June 1st, at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 additional ballistic missiles were launched at the same base. Both were intercepted cleanly this time, with no debris reaching the base and no casualties reported. CENTCOM's public statement characterized the command's posture as remaining vigilant and continuing to protect American forces from Iranian aggression, while simultaneously supporting the ongoing ceasefire framework, language whose internal tension this analysis's broader coverage has documented repeatedly since, simultaneously claiming ceasefire support while actively defending against ceasefire violations from the same nominal counterparty. On that same day, June 1st, the IRGC Navy fired a cruise missile that struck the container ship MSC Sarisa, a Panama-flagged vessel operated by a major Mediterranean shipping company near Qasr, Iraq. 2 separate impacts struck the vessel, the first occurring while the harbor pilot was still aboard, the second striking the crew area and producing a hull breach along with a significant onboard fire. The shipping company's public statement confirmed all crew members survived, characterizing their conduct during the engagement as exceptionally professional under the circumstances. Iran characterized this strike as retaliation for an American Hellfire missile strike that had disabled an Iranian tanker, the Leon Star, several days earlier. An engagement this analysis's broader coverage has previously documented in detail, where a precision Hellfire strike through the vessel's engine room left the ship floating but disabled rather than destroyed. The crew's survival under these specific circumstances deserves brief additional attention because a harbor pilot still aboard during the first impact and a subsequent strike directly against the crew quarters describes a sequence of events whose outcome, every crew member surviving despite 2 direct missile impacts against an occupied commercial vessel, reflects either a considerable degree of fortunate timing in terms of crew positioning at the moment of impact, or a well-rehearsed emergency response protocol that allowed the crew to reach safe positions and execute damage control procedures effectively despite the vessel sustaining a hull breach and an active onboard fire. Commercial shipping companies operating in contested waters throughout this conflict have, by necessity, developed considerably more sophisticated emergency response training and protocols than would have been standard practice in this industry before this conflict began, and this specific engagement's survivable outcome, despite its apparent severity, is consistent with that broader pattern of maritime industry adaptation to an operating environment. This analysis's broader coverage has documented as fundamentally more hazardous than commercial shipping companies were institutionally prepared for when this conflict's maritime dimension first began escalating. Let's examine what this specific sequence, 3 strikes against a single American base within 5 days, plus a cruise missile attack against unrelated commercial shipping, all occurring during a period both sides nominally characterized as an active ceasefire, establishes about Iran's actual operational capability 4 weeks into what this analysis has since documented as a far longer and more complex diplomatic military cycle than anyone observing this specific 5-day window could have anticipated. The question this analysis considers most analytically important from this period, and one whose answer still informs the broader picture this analysis has tracked through the subsequent weeks, is this: how does a country that has absorbed the level of sustained military punishment Iran had already absorbed by early June still retain the capability to keep launching ballistic missiles at American bases? The answer requires examining both Iran's targeting persistence and the specific layered defense architecture that was, even 4 weeks ago, achieving a remarkably high but not perfect interception rate against that persistent threat. Let's establish the complete operational sequence in chronological order, because the pattern this sequence reveals is more analytically significant than any single engagement within it. On May 27th, American forces struck Iranian drone ground control facilities near Bandar Abbas in direct response to the downing of an American MQ-9 Reaper over the Strait of Hormuz, a standard rules of engagement response to a specific provocation. Iran did not absorb this response passively. The following day, May 28th, Iran fired the Fatah 1 and 10 at Ali al-Salam, producing the partial intercept casualty and drone loss event this analysis has already detailed. On June 1st, American forces struck additional Iranian military targets in further response, inflicting substantial damage across multiple locations near Bandar Abbas. Iran, in turn, shot down an American MQ-1 Predator drone that same weekend. A separate engagement, this analysis's broader coverage has previously examined in detail in connection with IRGC Aerospace Force Commander Hajizadeh's public claim of personal credit for the shootdown. That same night, June 1st, at 11 p.m. Eastern, the two additional ballistic missiles targeted Ali al-Salam, both successfully intercepted. And, on that same day, the IRGC Navy struck the MSC Sarisa near Qasr. This sequence, strike, counterstrike, counter-counterstrike, occurring across less than a week with each side's specific action triggering an apparently calibrated response from the other within hours rather than days, establishes a pattern this analysis's subsequent coverage has documented repeatedly across the following weeks, a tit-for-tat escalation cycle whose specific rhythm and proportionality calibration this analysis has since traced through the May 7th counterstrike, the June 6th Oro 230 engagement, and most recently, the June 26th, 27th second night strikes following the Ever Lovely and Panama tanker attacks. The pattern established 4 weeks ago is, in retrospect, the same pattern that has continued operating, with variations in specific platforms and targets, but with the same fundamental tit-for-tat proportionality logic through every subsequent week this analysis has documented. Now, let's get into the specific propaganda dimension of the IRGC's public statement characterizing the MSC Sarisa strike, because the specific language deployed deserves examination as a recurring rhetorical pattern. This analysis has documented across multiple subsequent IRGC public statements. The IRGC's official statement characterized the Sarisa strike as a reciprocal operation conducted in response to what it termed an aggressive attack by, in its specific phrasing, the terrorist and child-killing U.S. Army against the Iranian vessel Leon Star. This characterization, casting Iran's strike against an unrelated commercial vessel as justified retaliation for an earlier American strike against an Iranian asset, while employing maximally inflammatory rhetorical framing of the American action, is consistent with the broader pattern this analysis has documented across the IRGC's public communication strategy throughout this conflict, characterizing nearly every American defensive or retaliatory action as the original aggression, regardless of the actual chronological sequence of provocation and response, in an apparent attempt to shape international and domestic Iranian audience perception of who bears responsibility for the conflict's continuation. This specific rhetorical pattern deserves examination as a deliberate information operations methodology, rather than simply incidental propagandistic excess, because its consistency across multiple distinct engagements throughout this conflict suggests a coordinated communication strategy, rather than ad hoc statements from individual spokespersons. The specific sequence, Iran initiates or escalates an engagement, America responds defensively or in calibrated retaliation, and Iran's subsequent public statement characterizes America's response as the original unprovoked aggression, requires a degree of narrative discipline and message coordination that this analysis assesses as evidence of a genuinely organized institutional communications apparatus operating in parallel with the IRGC's military operations, rather than spontaneous individual commentary. The specific target audiences for this messaging strategy include Iran's own domestic population, whose access to independent verification of the actual chronological sequence of events is severely restricted by the information environment this analysis's broader coverage has documented extensively, as well as international audiences and media outlets whose uncritical repetition of Iranian state characterizations this analysis's broader coverage has flagged as a recurring concern throughout its assessment of how this conflict's narrative has been shaped across different media environments. Now, let's get into the specific commander attrition this analysis documented 4 weeks ago, because the pattern of IRGC senior leadership losses established by this point in the conflict provides important context for understanding the institutional fragility. This analysis's more recent coverage has documented in considerably greater detail through the Khamenei deniability statement, the Lunin-style mutiny indicators in the parallel Russia coverage, and the broader hardline versus pragmatic faction tensions this analysis has tracked extensively. By early June, Iran had already lost 2 senior IRGC commanders in rapid succession. General Hossein Salami, the IRGC's commander who had spent years publicly promising to annihilate both the United States and Israel, was killed during the conflict's opening phase, the event this analysis's broader coverage has referenced as occurring during Operation Epic Fury's initial strikes. His replacement, General Pakpour, was killed on the same war's first day in a separate engagement. This meant that by the time the Ali al-Salam strike sequence and the MSC Sarissa attack occurred, Iran had already cycled through its top military commanders at a pace that, even at the time, prompted serious analytical questions about institutional continuity and command stability within the IRGC's senior leadership structure. Questions this analysis's subsequent coverage has continued documenting through the institutional fracture evidence accumulated across the following weeks. A senior Iranian official, identified as Mohammad Jafar Asadi, deputy head of Iran's Central Military Command, Khatam al-Anbiya, stated publicly around this period that the United States demands Iran's total surrender and that in his characterization, the Iranian nation will never surrender, concluding that absent surrender, continued war is inevitable. This kind of maximalist public rhetoric, delivered by senior IRGC-aligned officials, even as the organization's command structure was experiencing the rapid leadership attrition. This analysis, as just documented, is consistent with the broader institutional pattern. This analysis's subsequent coverage has identified repeatedly an organization whose public messaging maintains maximal defiance regardless of the actual operational and institutional pressures it is simultaneously absorbing internally. Now let's get into the layered missile defense architecture this analysis documented 4 weeks ago, because the specific technical detail established at this point provides the quantitative foundation underlying everything this analysis's subsequent coverage has built upon when discussing intercept rates and defense system performance. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD, engages ballistic missiles at high altitude both inside and outside the atmosphere using pure kinetic impact rather than an explosive warhead. A kinetic kill vehicle traveling at approximately Mach 8 that physically collides with the incoming missile body, with the closing speed physics alone providing sufficient destructive energy without requiring any explosive payload. By early June, the United States had redeployed THAAD batteries from positions in the Indo-Pacific Command and European Command areas of responsibility, specifically to Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. A redeployment this analysis's broader coverage has previously noted carries genuine strategic opportunity cost, given the finite global inventory of THAAD batteries and the corresponding reduction in coverage available for other theaters, including the Indo-Pacific theater, where Chinese strategic planners, as this analysis's broader coverage on the Hormuz confrontation and Helios deployment has documented extensively, are tracking American defensive asset allocation closely for their own Taiwan contingency planning purposes. This specific redeployment decision deserves additional analytical weight, because it represents a concrete, measurable instance of the resource trade-off problem this analysis's broader coverage has examined repeatedly in the context of America's simultaneous multi-theater commitments. Every THAAD battery physically relocated from the Pacific or European theater to the Gulf is a battery whose absence from its original theater is, by definition, observable and accessible by the adversaries operating in that theater, meaning the specific redeployment decision this analysis documented 4 weeks ago was not simply an internal logistics choice, but a visible strategic signal that Chinese, Russian, and North Korean military planners could and likely did incorporate directly into their own assessment of American defensive posture and readiness in their respective regions during this exact window. This is precisely the kind of cross-theater strategic interdependency this analysis's broader coverage has documented through the China PLA-F Taiwan sortie pause analysis and the broader pattern of Beijing extracting maximum intelligence value from periods of American multi-theater engagement. The second defensive layer, Patriot PASI-3 missiles, addresses the mid-tier threat category, shorter-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and potentially larger drone threats, though this analysis's broader coverage on the APKWS cost economics has already established why expending a Patriot interceptor against a drone target represents poor economic logic relative to lower-cost alternatives. The Patriot battery photographed at Ali al-Salam had been operating continuously throughout this period, working in direct coordination with Kuwaiti air defense assets. The specific intercept sequence on May 28th, Kuwaiti air defense is engaging and partially intercepting the Fatah 110, with the resulting debris field producing the casualties and drone losses this analysis has already documented, represents not a system failure in the conventional sense, but the straightforward physics consequence of intercepting a fast-moving ballistic missile at relatively low altitude directly over the base being protected. Even a successful intercept at that geometry produces a debris field whose fragments retain sufficient kinetic energy and mass to cause damage and casualties on the ground below. Whether subsequent intercept geometry could be adjusted to engage incoming threats at greater standoff distance from the protected base, reducing the specific debris field risk, was an open tactical question. At the time this analysis first documented this engagement sequence, the third layer involves Arleigh Burke-class destroyers positioned offshore, firing SM-3 Standard missiles against ballistic missiles during their boost phase, engaging threats considerably earlier in their flight trajectory before terminal descent phase even begins, providing the longest range intercept option within this combined architecture. At least one confirmed SM-3 engagement against an Iranian ballistic missile occurring over Turkish airspace had already been documented earlier in this conflict by the time this analysis first compiled this layered defense assessment. The specific boost phase engagement geometry this SM-3 capability provides represents a meaningfully different tactical advantage than either THAAD's mid-course intercept or Patriot's terminal phase intercept. A missile destroyed during its boost phase has not yet separated its re-entry vehicle, has not yet deployed any maneuvering or decoy countermeasures it might carry, and critically, has not yet had the opportunity to release the kind of debris field over a protected base that the May 28th Fatah 110 intercept demonstrated as a genuine residual risk, even from an otherwise successful engagement. This is the specific reason boost phase intercept capability, while geographically and operationally more constrained than the other two layers, given its dependence on having a naval asset positioned with appropriate geometric access to the missile's launch trajectory, represents the theoretically most complete solution within this layered architecture when the specific operational circumstances allow its employment. Combined across this three-layer architecture, expert assessments available at this point in the conflict place the overall interception rate across the entire Middle East theater at approximately 90 to 92%, a figure this analysis characterized at the time as genuinely extraordinary, and one that subsequent engagements this analysis has documented across the following weeks have generally continued to validate as a reasonably accurate baseline, even as specific individual engagement results have varied. The May 28th partial intercept event represents precisely what the remaining roughly 8% failure rate looks like in practical terms. A missile that is technically intercepted, but whose resulting debris field still produces casualties and material losses, illustrating that even a system performing at a 90+% success rate generates meaningful recurring costs from its residual failure rate, when that failure rate is applied against a sustained, repeated attack tempo rather than a single isolated engagement. Iran's awareness of this defensive mathematics is itself analytically significant. By this point in the conflict, Iran had already begun fielding maneuvering re-entry vehicles on at least some portion of its remaining ballistic missile inventory. Warheads specifically engineered to alter their flight trajectory during terminal descent in ways designed to defeat the predictable arc intercept geometry that conventional ballistic missile defense systems are optimized against. This represents a direct, technically sophisticated adaptation, specifically targeting the mathematical assumptions underlying the 90 to 92% intercept rate this analysis has just documented, meaning that figure should be understood as a managed threat assessment rather than a permanently solved engineering problem. Consistent with the broader principle, this analysis has emphasized repeatedly throughout its coverage. The adversary retains agency and continues adapting, and any static assessment of intercept rate performance risks becoming outdated as both sides continue iterating their respective offensive and defensive technologies. Now let's get into the bunker and tunnel infrastructure. This analysis examined 4 weeks ago, because the specific ISR challenge this infrastructure represents connects directly to the decoy bunker verification problem. This analysis's subsequent coverage has examined extensively in connection with the Isfahan strike's secondary explosions. Iran's ballistic missile production and storage infrastructure is substantially concentrated within hardened underground facilities throughout the country, with particular concentration in the rugged terrain of the Zagros mountain range, where hidden tunnel entrances allow mobile launchers to be rolled out for launch operations and then returned to concealed underground storage. Should the ceasefire framework collapse entirely and full combat operations resume, the platforms this analysis assessed as most likely to return to active employment against this specific target category were the B-2 stealth bomber, capable of addressing the largest, most hardened underground facilities, and the F-15E Strike Eagle carrying the GBU-72. The same 5,000-pound bunker-penetrating weapon this analysis's subsequent coverage has documented in extensive technical and operational detail in connection with the Isfahan underground missile city strike. The specific ISR challenge complicating any targeting campaign against this infrastructure, even 4 weeks ago, was Iran's deliberate construction of decoy bunker facilities throughout these same mountain ranges. Fake installations, specifically engineered to emit radar signatures and other detectable signals, consistent with genuine ballistic missile storage facilities, designed specifically to induce American forces to expend expensive precision munitions against targets containing no actual military value. This is precisely the decoy bunker problem this analysis's subsequent coverage has examined in extensive detail in connection with the Isfahan strike's secondary explosions, where this analysis identified the central unresolved question as whether the explosions documented represented penetration of a genuine deep missile reserve or destruction of an elaborately constructed decoy structure. The fact that this analysis had already identified and documented this decoy bunker challenge 4 weeks before the Isfahan strike occurred provides useful confirmation that the verification ambiguity this analysis's subsequent coverage treated as a genuinely open analytical question was not a post hoc rationalization, but a documented anticipated tactical reality that Pentagon targeting planners were explicitly accounting for well before any specific strike against this infrastructure category occurred. The specific engineering logic behind Iran's decoy construction deserves brief additional examination. Because it illustrates a broader asymmetric warfare principle this analysis has documented operating across multiple distinct domains throughout this conflict. A decoy bunker is, by design, considerably cheaper to construct than a genuine hardened missile storage facility, because the decoy only needs to replicate the specific signatures that overhead ISR collection would detect and characterize as consistent with genuine military infrastructure. Radar reflectivity, thermal signatures, vehicle traffic patterns, and similar externally observable indicators, without needing to actually provide the structural hardening, ventilation, environmental control, and missile handling infrastructure that a genuine deep storage facility requires. This cost asymmetry means that for every dollar Iran spends constructing a convincing decoy, American forces face the prospect of expending a multi-$100,000 precision munition in the case of conventional guided bombs, or potentially a multi-million-dollar specialized penetrating weapon in the case of the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. This analysis's broader coverage has documented in connection with Operation Midnight Hammer against a target containing no actual military value. This is structurally the same cost asymmetry principle this analysis has documented in the inverse direction through the Helios and APKWS economic analysis. In that case, American directed energy and laser-guided rocket technology inverting the cost asymmetry that favored Iran's drone swarm doctrine. The decoy bunker problem represents a domain where the cost asymmetry still favors Iran, at least with respect to forcing inefficient American munitions expenditure, even as the broader strategic and military balance this analysis has documented throughout its coverage continues favoring American and coalition forces overwhelmingly in essentially every other dimension of this conflict. Now, let's get into the broader strategic picture. This analysis assessed 4 weeks ago regarding Iran's underlying negotiating motivations, because this assessment has been substantially validated by the institutional fracture evidence. This analysis' subsequent coverage has documented in far greater detail through the Khamenei deniability statement, the Assembly of Experts letter, and the broader civilian versus IRGC authority gap. This analysis has tracked as the central structural problem behind every diplomatic near-miss this conflict has produced. By early June, Iran's military capacity had already been substantially degraded. Its air force functionally eliminated, its blue water navy eliminated, its missile production lines significantly damaged and set back, with the daily ballistic missile launch rate having dropped from an estimated 100 missiles per day at the conflict's opening phase to an assessed capacity of perhaps a dozen per day should full hostilities resume. Given this degraded capacity, this analysis assessed at the time that Iran's actual negotiating objective was not a resumption of full hostilities, which Iranian leadership understood its remaining capacity could not sustain, but rather a negotiated settlement structured in a way that did not appear, to either international or domestic Iranian audiences, to constitute outright surrender, because a regime perceived as having accepted unconditional American terms faced not only international humiliation, but a genuine domestic survival risk, given the competing internal factions this analysis assessed as positioned to seize power from whichever faction was perceived as having shown excessive weakness in negotiations. This assessment that Iran's negotiating behavior would be characterized by an oscillating, internally contradictory pattern of simultaneous deal-seeking and continued military provocation, driven by competing internal factions, each attempting to avoid being perceived as the faction that capitulated, has been substantially validated by every subsequent development this analysis has documented across the following weeks. The Islamabad walkout, the toll booth betrayal, the multiple ceasefire signings followed by immediate violations, the Khamenei deniability statement explicitly distancing the supreme leader from a deal he claims he never wanted, the Assembly of Experts letter formally endorsing hardline red lines, and the consistent pattern of IRGC military action proceeding independently of whatever the civilian diplomatic track was simultaneously negotiating. The specific mechanism this analysis identified 4 weeks ago: competing factions unwilling to be the one perceived as blinking first, because the political consequence of appearing weak is potentially more dangerous to any individual faction's survival than continued war, has proven to be a remarkably durable and accurate predictive framework for understanding everything this analysis has subsequently documented about Iran's diplomatic behavior across the following month. Now, let's get into the global developments this analysis documented during the same period, because both connect directly to threads this analysis's subsequent coverage has examined in considerably greater depth. Russia, during the same general window, flew its Su-57 advanced stealth fighter in a two-seat configuration, specifically modified to allow a second crew member to control accompanying drone assets from the rear cockpit. This analysis assessed this development at the time as carrying a genuinely mixed strategic signal, a meaningful demonstration of operational drone control integration capability, but one whose specific implementation, requiring a dedicated second human crew member rather than achieving comparable coordination through autonomous or AI-assisted systems, also illustrated a meaningful limitation in Russia's autonomous coordination and data link integration technology relative to the more software-driven AI-assisted approaches. This analysis's subsequent coverage has documented extensively in connection with American systems like Anduril's Lattice AI and the broader collaborative combat aircraft ecosystem this analysis examined in connection with the F-47 program. A second human crew member solving a coordination problem that more advanced systems address through autonomous software integration represents a meaningful capability gap, even while the underlying operational concept, manned-unmanned teaming between a stealth fighter and accompanying drone assets, reflects the same broader strategic direction this analysis has documented across multiple air forces simultaneously. The specific trade-off this two-seat configuration represents deserves additional examination, because it illustrates a recurring pattern in how different militaries have approached the manned-unmanned teaming problem given their respective technological starting points. The American approach, reflected in the Lattice AI architecture and the broader collaborative combat aircraft concept, treats autonomous coordination as the primary objective, with human oversight functioning at a supervisory rather than continuous control level. A single pilot or operator monitoring and authorizing autonomous system behavior rather than actively flying each individual drone asset in real time. The Russian two-seat Su-57 configuration instead places a dedicated human operator in direct, continuous control of accompanying drone assets, which provides more granular tactical control in any individual engagement, but simultaneously imposes a hard ceiling on how many drone assets a single aircraft can effectively coordinate, since human cognitive bandwidth for simultaneous multi-asset control is considerably more limited than what an appropriately designed autonomous coordination system can theoretically manage. This specific design choice reflects a reasonable near-term solution to the manned-unmanned teaming problem, given Russia's demonstrated technology base, but it also represents a structural ceiling on the scalability of this specific operational concept relative to the autonomous coordination approach American systems are increasingly built around, a distinction whose practical significance would become most apparent in any scenario requiring a single aircraft to coordinate a meaningfully large number of accompanying drone assets simultaneously, a capability the autonomous coordination approach is specifically designed to provide, and the two-seat human control approach is structurally less well-suited to scale toward. China, during the same period, conducted 2 major naval deployments in the South China Sea and West Pacific, specifically timed to coincide with the ongoing Balikatan 2026 joint exercises involving American, Philippine, and Japanese forces. Deployments this analysis characterized at the time as a deliberate signal that defense cooperation among regional partners would be met with a corresponding increase in PLA naval presence specifically intended to complicate and discourage that cooperation. This is the same broader pattern this analysis's subsequent coverage has documented in considerably greater detail through the Hormuz naval confrontation analysis and the China PLAF-Taiwan sortie pattern examined in connection with the jellyfish drone formation coverage. Beijing's consistent strategic behavior of using regional military presence and naval positioning, specifically to extract maximum intelligence value and strategic signaling benefit from periods when American attention and resources are simultaneously engaged across multiple theaters, rather than treating American multi-theater engagement as creating an opportunity China declines to exploit. Here is the honest assessment of what revisiting this 4-week-old baseline contributes to this analysis's current understanding, examined from today's vantage point with the considerable benefit of everything documented since. The specific quantitative foundation this analysis established 4 weeks ago, the 90 to 92% layered intercept rate, the specific THAAD Patriot SM-3 architecture, the maneuvering reentry vehicle adaptation, the decoy bunker ISR challenge, has proven to be the durable technical baseline underlying every subsequent engagement this analysis has documented across the following month, even as specific tactical details have evolved. The strategic assessment regarding Iran's internally contradictory negotiating behavior, driven by competing factions, each unwilling to be perceived as having capitulated first, has proven to be perhaps the single most predictively accurate framework this analysis, established at any point in its coverage, validated repeatedly through every subsequent diplomatic near-miss, walkout, and institutional deniability statement. This analysis has documented in the weeks since. It is worth closing with an explicit accounting of precisely which elements of this 4-week-old baseline have held up under the weight of everything subsequently documented, and which have required revision as new evidence emerged. The intercept rate architecture has held up essentially unchanged in its fundamental structure, though this analysis's subsequent coverage of Helios, Odin, and APKWS has added an entirely new directed energy and cost parity dimension to the broader counter-drone and counter-missile picture that this 4-week-old baseline, focused specifically on ballistic missile defense, did not yet capture. The decoy bunker ISR challenge has held up precisely as anticipated, validated directly by the Isfahan strike's unresolved evidentiary ambiguity. The commander attrition pattern has continued and arguably accelerated, with this analysis's subsequent coverage documenting the broader institutional fracture this early leadership turnover foreshadowed in considerably more granular detail through the Khamenei deniability statement and the Assembly of Experts letter. And the strategic assessment of Iran's internally contradictory negotiating posture has proven, if anything, understated relative to what actually transpired. This analysis 4 weeks ago anticipated oscillation between deal-seeking and provocation, but could not have specifically anticipated the precise sequence of the Islamabad walkout, the Versailles signing, the immediate Lebanon-triggered fourth closure, and the specific institutional documents, like the Assembly letter, that have since made the underlying factional dynamic considerably more concrete and well-documented than this earlier, more inferential assessment could establish at the time. Going back to examine this specific baseline 4 weeks later confirms that the fundamental dynamics driving this conflict, the layered defense architecture's managed but imperfect effectiveness, the decoy and verification ambiguity complicating every strike against hardened infrastructure, and the structural impossibility of any single Iranian faction safely agreeing to genuine capitulation were already fully visible in the available evidence weeks before the more dramatic subsequent developments. This analysis has documented made those same dynamics impossible to ignore. The 5-day window this analysis revisited today was not a prelude to the conflict's defining dynamics. It was those dynamics, fully formed, 4 weeks before most observers recognized them as the pattern that would govern everything that followed. And they remain, as of today, the same pattern this analysis continues tracking through every subsequent ceasefire, closure, and diplomatic near-miss this conflict has produced since.